You know what's fascinating? There's this entire generation of people who don't know where they belong. They're too young to be Gen X, too old to be millennials, and for decades, nobody had a name for them. Nobody made the think pieces about them. Nobody wrote the hot takes. They were just quietly stuck in the middle, feeling like they somehow missed the memo that defined everyone else around them. They're called Xennials, born roughly between 1976 and 1985. And if you're one of them, there's a very good chance you've spent most of your adult life feeling like you exist slightly out of phase with the world. Not broken, not lost, just running on a completely different operating system than the people right next to you. And here's what people miss. That feeling isn't random. It's not in your head. It's actually the psychological fingerprint of living through the most disorienting cultural transition in modern human history. Right in the middle of it. Not before it. Not after it. Right in the middle. So let's get into it. First, you need to understand what makes Xennials genuinely different from every other generational cohort. And I'm not talking about the usual generational stuff, the avocado toast arguments or who killed what industry. I'm talking about something much deeper, something that happened at the neurological level. Xennials grew up analog and graduated into a digital world. Sounds simple, right? It's not. See, the people born before 1976, classic Gen X, they formed their entire adult identity in an analog world. The internet came along when they were already grown. They adapted to it, but it didn't shape them. And millennials born after 1985 or so, they grew up with the internet already there. It was ambient, normal, just part of the furniture of childhood. But Xennials, they did something neither group did. They built an analog childhood self, a complete identity with physical photo albums and landline phone calls and handwritten notes passed in class and spending entire summers outside genuinely unreachable by anyone. And then, right when their brains were in that critical late adolescent and early adult development window, the entire world digitized around them. Psychologists talk about a concept called schema disruption. Basically, when the mental model you've built for how the world works suddenly stops matching reality. Most people experience this once or twice in a lifetime. Xennials experienced it as a generation-wide event during the single most psychologically formative period of their lives. That's not a small thing. That reshapes how you process change, identity, and belonging for the rest of your life. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Xennials carry what researchers call a dual psychological identity. And this isn't just nostalgia. It's actually a functional split in how they relate to the world. On one side, they have the emotional wiring of people who grew up in pre-internet reality. They remember boredom. Real, deep, unmedicated boredom where you had to sit with your own thoughts for hours because there was literally nothing to swipe. They remember what it felt like for information to be slow, for waiting to be normal, for silence to not feel threatening. But on the other side, they adapted to the digital world early enough that they're not afraid of it either. They learned social media before it was optimized to be addictive. They remember when email felt like magic, when Google seemed like a superpower. They weren't dragged into the digital age reluctantly like older Gen Xers. They ran toward it with genuine excitement. So what does that create? A person who is simultaneously nostalgic for slowness and completely comfortable with speed. Someone who deeply values face-to-face connection and also lives on their phone without contradiction. Someone who can feel the difference between real life and digital life in a way that younger generations genuinely can't, because they never had the analog baseline to compare against. Psychologists call this kind of adaptive tension cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold two contradictory experiences and function effectively in both. And research consistently shows it's associated with higher emotional resilience, greater empathy, and stronger problem-solving under uncertainty. Xennials didn't develop this because they're special. They developed it because they had no choice. The world forced it on them at exactly the right moment for it to stick. Let's talk about the identity problem, because this is the one that actually hurts. Every other generation has a cultural story about itself. Boomers have the post-war optimism narrative. Gen X has the slacker, too cool to care, flannel-wearing cynicism narrative. Millennials have the participation trophy, avocado toast, student debt narrative, unfair as that is. Even Gen Z has the TikTok, mental health awareness, identity fluidity narrative. Xennials have nothing, no cultural story, no defining movie that captures them, no stereotype that fits. The pop culture they grew up on the early 90s, Nirvana and Reality Bites and Clarissa explains it all in AIM buddy lists and Tamagotchis. It doesn't get its own dedicated nostalgia machine the way the 80s do for older Gen X or the late 90s and early 2000s do for millennials. They exist in this cultural dead zone where the nostalgia industry hasn't figured out how to monetize them yet. And here's why that matters psychologically. Humans are deeply social creatures who locate their identity partly through shared narrative. We need to see ourselves reflected back in culture, in stories, in someone saying, yes, that's what it was like, that was real, you weren't imagining it. When that reflection doesn't exist, it creates a specific kind of low-level identity dissonance. Not a crisis, just a quiet, persistent sense of not quite fitting anywhere, of being between chapters in a book that was written for everyone else. A lot of Xennials describe feeling like imposters in both generational camps. Too earnest to be proper Gen X, too cynical to be proper millennials. Too old for certain cultural references, too young for others. And for years, they just internalized that as a personal quirk rather than recognizing it as a shared, completely legitimate generational experience. Now let's talk about something that rarely gets discussed: the specific psychological weight of being the last generation to have a childhood without consequence. Think about what that actually means. If you were born in 1980, you were a teenager before anyone had a digital record of who you were. Your embarrassing phase, gone. Your worst moments, not archived anywhere. Your experimental years, the trying on different identities, the saying stupid things, the figuring yourself out, all of it happened in a world that forgot. That is an extraordinary psychological gift that no generation after 1985 or so will ever fully receive. And most Xennials don't even realize how much it shaped them until they watch younger people navigating a world where everything is permanent and public from age 12. There's a concept in developmental psychology around the importance of psychological safe space for identity formation. The idea that people need room to fail privately, to experiment without an audience, to become themselves without being documented in the process. Xennials got that, fully, without even knowing it was something to be grateful for. But here's the flip side that people don't talk about. Xennials then had to make some of the biggest life decisions of their careers and early adulthood: job hunting, building professional reputations, navigating relationships, right as digital permanence was kicking in. They had private childhoods and suddenly very public adult lives. That's a jarring psychological transition, and it explains something you see a lot in Xennials: a kind of careful, almost instinctive privacy that younger generations sometimes read as being closed off. It's not aloofness. It's the behavioral residue of having lived in two completely different worlds with two completely different rules about what stays between you and what gets shared. Here's something interesting about how Xennials handle stress that researchers have started to pay attention to. Because they grew up before constant connectivity, they developed coping mechanisms that are actually quite rare now. They know how to be unreachable. They know what it feels like to work through a problem without immediately Googling it or crowdsourcing it or getting 17 opinions in a group chat. They developed an internal problem-solving muscle that most people who grew up fully digital are still trying to build. At the same time, they experienced enough of the early internet, the wild, unmonetized, genuinely experimental early internet, to have a healthy skepticism about digital spaces that younger generations who were born into the polished, algorithm-driven version sometimes lack. They remember when the internet was weird and human and kind of terrible in a charming way. Before engagement metrics, before the attention economy, before every platform was optimized to keep you scrolling at the expense of your actual mental health. That memory matters. It means Xennials have a reference point for what digital life could be versus what it became. And that creates a very specific kind of low-grade grief that's hard to articulate to someone who never experienced the before. It's like being one of the only people who remembers what a neighborhood felt like before a highway got built through it. You can see the highway. You can use the highway. You're fine. But you also remember something everyone else has already forgotten, and there's no one left to remember it with you. And then there's the career thing. Because generationally, Xennials got hit at every major economic turn. They entered the workforce right around the dot-com crash. They were hitting their peak earning years right as the 2008 financial crisis wiped out savings, housing equity, and job stability across the board. And just as they were getting to senior leadership positions in their careers, the pandemic restructured the entire economy again. Psychologists talk about something called cohort effects, the idea that the specific historical events a generation experiences during formative years leave permanent marks on their economic psychology, how they relate to job security, how they think about money, how much they trust institutions. Xennials got hit during every single vulnerable window, and yet the cultural narrative around economic struggle tends to focus on millennials with student debt or Gen Z entering a broken job market. Xennials mostly absorbed their hits quietly, in the Gen X tradition of not making it a whole thing. That stoicism is real, and it's something Xennials genuinely share with classic Gen X, the idea that you just handle it. You don't perform your struggle. You figure it out. But underneath that, there's often a very real, very under-acknowledged exhaustion from having adapted so many times to so many seismic shifts without anyone particularly noticing or nomming it. So what's the actual psychological profile of a Xennial when you pull it all together? They're adaptable in a way that's almost automatic because adaptation was required from them at every stage. They're nostalgic but not paralyzed by nostalgia. They can live fully in the present while still feeling the weight of what's been lost. They tend to have a high tolerance for ambiguity because their entire coming of age was ambiguous. They're often skeptical of institutional promises because they watched several institutions fail them in real time. And they carry a quiet, private interior life that was formed before the world decided everything needed to be shared. They're not Gen X, they're not millennials. And honestly, that might be exactly what makes them interesting. There's actually emerging research in generational psychology suggesting that microgeneration cohorts, the people who fall in the transitional gaps between major generational groups, often develop higher adaptive capacity precisely because they don't have the cultural scaffolding that tells them who they're supposed to be. They have to figure it out themselves. And the people who figure themselves out without a template tend to end up with a more durable, more genuinely self-constructed sense of identity. The generation that got no story wrote their own, quietly, without making a big deal of it, which is, honestly, very on-brand. So if you're a Xennial, here's what I want you to actually hear. That feeling of being between two worlds isn't a flaw in your psychology. It's the direct result of living through a genuinely unprecedented cultural transition at exactly the age when it would leave the deepest mark. The adaptability you have, the dual comfort with analog depth and digital speed, the privacy instinct, the internal coping muscle, the healthy skepticism, none of that is an accident. You were shaped by a very specific window of history that will never exist again. And maybe nobody made the think pieces about you. Maybe the nostalgia industry hasn't figured out your decade yet. Maybe you've spent years feeling like you don't quite fit either camp. but fitting neatly into a camp was never really the point, was it? If this hit home for you, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit that join button to become a channel member. I would genuinely appreciate it.